Excellent. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris, and today I'll be talking to you all a little bit about some of my work, which I've been carrying out as part of my PhD with University of Reading and Amgueddfa, Cymru, funded by Arts and Humanities Research Council. So, for this talk taking you all on a quick tour of late Bronze Age hoards from southeast and west Wales, with a focus on those objects which are characteristic of the Carp's tongue or Boughton-Vénat complex. Apologies in advance for my pronunciation of many places or terms. My French isn't quite up to scratch. So first of all, worth very briefly going over what's meant by terms Carp's tongue or Boughton-Vénat complex. Now, both terms are used to refer to a distinct group of fragmentary hoards which were buried in southeastern England and Atlantic France during the closing century of the late Bronze Age, so between roughly 900 and 800 BC. The Carp's tongue complex is the traditional term which has been in use for decades to describe this distinct group of hoards, but was recently argued by Dirk Brandherm and Magdalena Moscal del Hoyo in their 2014 paper. It has basically become a bit too cumbersome and problematic in light of recent finds and research, details of which I'm not going to go into today. To account for cross-channel distribution of these hoards, they proposed a new term, the Boughton-Vénat complex, which refers to two key assemblages, one from southeast England and one from Atlantic France. Now, in terms of recognizing elements of this Boughton-Vénat complex, there are several key object types which we can look for, many of which now have been recorded through a portable antiquities scheme and are shown here. We got Carp's tongue swords, particularly the type Nant, then end-winged axes, hogsback knives or razors, and purse or bag-shaped shapes. So, terminology out of the way. Let me introduce you all to my study area. So it encompasses southeast and west Wales, although been a little bit cheeky and included some of the southernmost parts of Ceredigion and Powys, so edging into mid Wales a bit there. And to date, there are around 314 find spots and 1,050 pieces of late Bronze Age metalwork reported from both regions. But for the sake of today's talk, we'll just be focusing on key aspects of this material. So, on this map are all 87 of the known, few suspected late Bronze Age hoards reported from both regions. Some of these are a bit more difficult to date precisely owing to condition of certain artifacts, but vast majority appear to have been deposited during the Ewart Park phase, so between 1000 and 800 BC. Those hoards and single finds relevant to the talk today highlighted in red, whilst the white squares represent those hoards which do not contain metalwork characteristic of the Boughton-Vénat complex. So starting with West Wales and westernmost hoard from the study area, we've got this small assemblage of artifacts discovered from Marlowe's and St. Bride's community in 2013, Pembrokeshire, declared treasure following year. Now, it's not going to win any beauty contests, but it's important for quite a few reasons. First and foremost, as you remember from the second slide, we've got a base fragment then of a pocket or bag-shaped shape on the left, and two Carp's tongue sword blade fragments then in the center of the screen. Sadly, missing the hilt fragments, there's no way at present of knowing whether these sword fragments belong to earlier or later types, but this is far from unusual. Swords tend to be found in fragments in dryland hoards, and they only appear to have been buried in a complete condition as single finds or from burials. And then on the right, then you get the fourth object, which is a multi-edged knife with a central perforation. Elongated hexagonal shape is a bit odd, but it can be broadly paralleled with the hogsback knives. And then lastly, but no means least, we got these 6 plano-convex ingot fragments. Now, we can measure size of hoards by weight or number of objects, fragments present, but in both cases, ingots make up the majority element of this hoard. If we look at the composition of recent hoard finds from Britain and Northern Ireland, so shown on the right, you can see how its overall composition contrasts quite nicely with the axe-dominant and axe-only hoards, which are concentrated in southeast Wales. So stepping back a little bit, you can see how the Marlows St. Bride's hoard fits in amongst this group of hoards from southern coast of Pembrokeshire. So in the centre, we got the freshwater west hoard, discovered around 1991. Current whereabouts are unknown. Unless someone within the audience knows about it, I'd love to hear. But on the right then, we've got the hoard from the Manabia community, discovered in 2010 and also reported as treasure. Overall character of the hoards fits with what might be expected of the Boughton-Vénat complex. They're all very fragmentary and with particular reference to the Marlow St. Bride's and freshwater west hoards, contain objects which were part of the cultural material repertoire of communities from southeastern England and Atlantic France. In many cases, it can be a bit difficult to determine exactly what direction of travel of objects was, but of interest here is all the ingot fragments from these 3 hoards, bar 1 from Marlow St. Bride. They're all of copper with minor lead components then, so perhaps in the future it'd be possible to trace where the copper was sourced from. But at the very least, in part, I like to think that these hoards were placed in reference to late Bronze Age sea routes, so very close to the coast. If we shift focus eastwards to southeast Wales, you can see that late Bronze Age communities in this area also had some connection with broader Atlantic traditions. Now, considering that there are nearly 200 single finds of late Bronze Age metalwork reported from southeast Wales, connection might seem thread-like, but it's an important one nonetheless. The end-winged axe from Sketty community in Swansea, reported to and recorded by PAS Cymru, is one of only 3 known end-winged axes and then 1 suspected one, which we'll move on to a bit later. However, the mostly complete single find of a carp's tongue sword from Llandeti, Powys, stands out in particular. The break edges along the surviving blade edges are quite jagged, and the lower break edge across the mid-ridge is inconsistent with the brown patina that you see across the rest of the sword, perhaps suggesting a high degree of post-depositional damage. And then, if this was the case, I do wonder whether the sword was originally buried complete or nearly complete, perhaps implying that the person or persons who deposited the sword had an understanding of broader Atlantic traditions at the time, which is just quite important considering that this sword falls quite outside of the core distribution area of these objects. And moving on, we've got this rather colourful hoard from Llancarvan community, Vale of Glamorgan, discovered in 2005 and reported as treasure. Now, even at a broad level, we can see how it differs from the hoards that we saw earlier from Pembrokeshire. Contains roughly even split of complete or near complete and fragmented objects. The majority of socketed axes are of South Wales type, sometimes referred to as Stagursey type axes, but that's a story for another day. And in this hoard, we've got yet another end-winged axe. So you see that on the far left with that lovely turquoise colour. And then another carp's tongue sword blade fragment. But a particular interest here is the inclusion of a Huelva type sword hilt fragment. So that's in the middle. Huelva type swords are one of the three main types of carp's tongue sword. They're defined by the abrupt angle or break between the grip and shoulder. And they're broadly contemporary with early Ewart Park or Blackmore phase, so around 1020 to 920 BC. And they predate majority of hoards which are associated with the Boughton-Vénat complex. So this example is particularly significant because it's the only one which has been reported to date from Britain. Presence of Huelva type fragment, then along with a couple of other fragments from this hoard, including Saint Nazaire sword fragment, which has got these gorgeous multiple grooved lines along the blade. Mean it's quite possible that we're looking at an early Ewart Park hoard. Moving a bit further east again, we've got this hoard, which was discovered in 2018 from Grosmont community in Monmouthshire. And again, at broad level, you can see some similarities with the Llancarvan hoard, mainly in terms of the strong presence of South Wales type axes. But on this occasion, we've got a spearhead, only one sword blade fragment, and then a couple of slightly unusual socketed axes. Well, you're probably all very used to this by now, but on the left, we've got a carp's tongue blade fragment, the lovely characteristic grooves down both sides of the midridge. But on the right, we've got two views of what's a bit of an unusual object. It's a slender axe, which hopefully you'll all be able to see appears to be a composite object where upper body of a socketed axe has been cast onto the blade of another axe. Now, quite possible that the blade end fragment has been cast onto this object derives from a palstave, but the majority of those which are contemporary with this hoard tend to have much narrower blades and sort of thicker bodies. They're perhaps suggesting that this blade itself derives from an end-winged axe. So that was the fourth potential end-winged axe from southeast Wales. And then worth also highlighting from this hoard is this particular axe. This has got some important implications about chronology of this hoard. Now, most of the other axes, typical Ewart Park phase, but some of the dimensions and features of this axe, namely the square, deep sort of front to back mouth, appears to anticipate sort of features which are more characteristic of type Sompton axes of the earliest Iron Age, perhaps suggesting late Ewart Park date for the hoard. And again, if we're looking at a late Ewart Park date, then that's more contemporary with the Boughton-Vénat complex. It's possible that the carp's tongue sword fragment earlier belongs to a type Nant sword. But then I do also wonder whether we might instead, with a couple of the objects in the hoard, be looking at slightly curated material, probably overinterpreting it, but the composite socketed axe that we saw earlier could resemble coming together of two slightly older objects, maybe brought together then to create a functional tool, but while still retaining original features. So, been a bit of a whirlwind tour of the Boughton-Vénat and Carp's tongue elements in southeast and West Wales, and there's still quite a bit of work to be done on it. However, hope that I've just sort of demonstrated how some of the hoards from West and Southeast Wales stack up against each other, as well as just some of the interesting elements of my research which currently bringing together. It's just worth emphasising as well that without discoveries of treasure and work of PAS, especially PAS Cymru for me over the past 25 years, there are very little evidence of Carp's tongue or Boughton-Vénat elements. For West Wales in particular, the new discoveries are helping to write like a complete new chapter for the later prehistory of the region. So we know very little about in terms of the metalwork deposition historically. And Finn,